Welcome back, everybody. It's Getaway Day, Friday, June 27th, 2025. Born on this date in 1880, Helen Keller of Tuscumbia. And in 1964, former San Antonio Spur Chuck Person of Brantley. Today, we're going to speak with AL.com reporter Ivana Rinkiu, who started a new investigative series with a story on a death row inmate who allegedly killed a woman at a crime scene at which we now know investigators collected only one person's DNA, and it wasn't the guy found guilty. There's a lot to this case. Ivana's going to break it down for us. First, though, we have stories on a fireball in broad daylight, what led to Tommy Tuberville's mosque invite, the FBI pausing a move to Redstone Arsenal, and remembering the poop cruise, not to be confused with the poop train. Sometimes 8-year-old me would have loved this job. I'm Mike Morgan, and we're down in Alabama.
Starting a business can seem like a daunting task, unless you have a partner like Shopify. They have the tools you need to start and grow your business. From designing a website to marketing to selling and beyond, Shopify can help with everything you need. There's a reason millions of companies like Mattel, Heinz, and Allbirds continue to trust and use them. With Shopify on your side, turn your big business idea into... Sign up for your $1 per month trial at shopify.com/special offer.
The meteor that appeared as a daytime fireball across part of the South Thursday was seen in some parts of North Alabama, reports AL.com's Patrick Darrington. According to NASA, the meteor had split from a larger meteor and plunged to Earth. It was not a typical space rock. It had a brightness measure that surpassed that of a full moon and added to its fireball appearance. It was also seen in Georgia, Tennessee, South Carolina, and North Carolina. A Muslim civil rights group in Alabama is asking gubernatorial candidate and current U.S. Senator Tommy Tuberville to visit a mosque, reports AL.com's William Thornton. The Alabama chapter of the Council on American Islamic Relations issued the invite after Tuberville referenced an Islamic atmosphere while more generally criticizing sanctuary cities and illegal immigration. Tuberville said federal funding to those cities could be cut off. Quote, President Trump can do anything he wants when it comes to the federal. Again, these inner city rats, they live off the federal government. And that's one reason we're $37 trillion in debt. And it's time we find these rats and we send them back home that are living off the American taxpayers that are working very hard every week to pay taxes. End quote. Now, during the conversation, Tuberville said there's a difference between what he called good Muslims and radical Islamists. He said those in the country illegally won't get any handouts down south. Quote, bring your lunch with you because you're not going to be welcomed if you're going to bring that communist Islamic atmosphere with you. We're not going to deal with it. CARE attorney Britton Shields issued a statement inviting Tuberville to a mosque. It read in part that, quote, American Muslims have been thriving in Alabama for decades, creating an atmosphere of fellowship, charity, and devotion to God, end quote. Well, the FBI has paused plans to move its training facility to Huntsville's Redstone Arsenal, reports AL.com's John R. Roby. How that might affect what ultimately moves from D.C. to Huntsville remains to be seen. A spokesperson for the FBI at the Arsenal said that a national academy is still part of the FBI's long-term plan for Redstone. Although the FBI National Academy Associates posted on social media that, quote, we're pleased to share that the FBI has decided not to move forward with a National Academy pilot in Huntsville, citing infrastructure limitations. If you've been following Alabama news for a few years, you remember the poop train, a controversy in central Alabama that involved sewage sludge from the Northeast. Now, if you followed Alabama news for a few more years, then you remember the poop cruise. The poop cruise was a February 2013 trip across the Gulf of Mexico aboard the Carnival Triumph, which was stranded at sea after an engine fire. The 4,000 plus poor passengers, bless their hearts, were without power, air conditioning, or toilets that worked. They ran low on food and were eating tomato and onion sandwiches, and the tomatoes were store-bought. What they did have, however, were those red biohazard bags, which they used as substitutes for a commode, hence the poop cruise. Mobile had been out of the cruise business for a couple of years, but the city had the closest port to the Triumph and played the part of gracious host. Now, if you want a detailed look at that very uncomfortable saga, AL.com's John Sharp reports that a documentary is out titled Trainwreck: Poop Cruise. Now, when I said the colon part just then, I'm talking about punctuation in the title. It has a runtime of 55 minutes and is now available on Netflix. Now, meanwhile, years ago, the Carnival Triumph underwent hundreds of thousands of dollars in repairs and upgrades, along with a name change to the Carnival Sunrise. Hey, let's take a commercial break to keep the lights on around here. When we come back, we have Ivana Harinciu on the first story in her Alabama versus Science series. Y'all stay with us.
Your burger is served, and this is our finest Pepsi Zero Sugar. Its sweet profile perfectly balances the savory notes of your burger.
That is one perfect combination. Burgers deserve Pepsi.
PMS, pregnancy, menopause. Being a woman is a lot. Ollie supports you and yours with expert solutions for every age and life stage. They just launched 2 new products exclusively at Walmart. Period Hero combats bloat, mood swings, and more during PMS. And Balance Perimeno to support hormonal balance, mood, and metabolism during perimenopause. Grab yours at Ollie.com. Ollie! These statements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration. This product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease.
Thanks for staying with us, everybody. Christopher Barber has been sitting on Alabama's death row for 3 decades. Of course, DNA forensics have come a long way since the early 90s, and people are talking about what's been proven or disproven in his case. The state of Alabama doesn't seem to want to be in that conversation just yet. Let's welcome back to Down in Alabama reporter Ivana Harinciu to tell us a little more about her reporting on this case. Good to have you back, Ivana.
Thank you, Ike. Always good to be here.
What can you tell us about what you found out?
Well, Chris Barber's story, it's kind of a long, winding tale, but the long and short of it is that Chris Barber was convicted in the early 90s for a brutal rape and killing of a 40-year-old single mother in her home in a neighborhood of Montgomery. And at the time, the only solid evidence that police had was a confession from Chris Barber. Now, right after that confession happened, Chris Barber has recanted that confession, and he has said since that he was pressured by police and law enforcement to make that confession. But regardless, he was convicted and sentenced to death row, and he's been there for over 30 years. His lawyers have been seeking for decades to retest DNA in his case. They said that would exonerate him and show who actually committed this really brutal crime and this murder of Thelma Roberts. And they eventually got permission. The state would not agree to the DNA testing, so they had to wait on a judge to order it. But they eventually got that permission and were able to test it a couple of years ago.
The DNA evidence pointed toward someone else, did it not?
Yes, the DNA actually came back. It did not come back to Chris Barber, and it did not come back to his co-defendant. So his co-defendant, this is where it gets a little tricky. His name was also Chris, so I'm just going to call him by his last name. His name, the co-defendant's name, was Christopher Hester.
Okay.
So the DNA came back, and it did not belong to Barber or to Hester. Or to a third person who had been implicated but never charged in the case. So this DNA came back to somebody that was never involved in the case whatsoever. But I won't say that it was an unknown person, because it actually came back to man who was a boy at the time who lived next door, or rather across the street from the victim. And this person's name had come up before. This person was a friend of Miss Roberts' son. He was about that same age. He was a young teenager at the time. And then in the years after Mrs. Roberts' murder, this man, his name is Jerry Tyrone Jackson, he was convicted in another brutal murder in North Alabama, and he's been sitting in prison for years now for that murder. But he had never been charged in the Roberts case and had never been identified as a suspect. I don't believe he was ever questioned in the Roberts case at all. But again, I don't want to say it came back to an unknown person, because it's somebody that we do know who did have a criminal record, is already sitting in Alabama's prisons, and somebody who was known to the Roberts family.
Okay, so in the original case that the state had, you had Barber and two co-defendants, and they are definitely separate people from the man who left the DNA evidence at the scene.
Correct. And one thing that was important is there was no other DNA at the scene other than what was found on Miss Roberts herself. So there was no other DNA that was that they were able to collect and test. So they were only able to collect what was on Miss Roberts herself. Okay.
Now Barber's confession in the state story was that he was involved with the murder, helped one of the other guys with the rape. Is it that unlikely that his DNA wasn't collected at the scene?
So his lawyers would say yes. His lawyers would say that not only is it important that his DNA was not collected, because if you remember, Chris Barber's confession included that the reason they went to this woman's house was to drink inside the house. We also know that Miss Roberts did not drink alcohol. She was also a single mother of two, and she was a church-going woman, and this was in the early 90s. And she, again, was sober, according to her friends and her family. So that was something that stood out. But also, there was no beer cans or no traces of beer ever found in her home, which is what Chris Barber, during his confession, said happened, that he and his co-defendants went into the house, drank beer, and then the rape happened, and then Chris Barber, killed her after assisting in this rape. So he and his team had always said he did not rape her. But I think his team would say that it's surprising that no DNA came from her, no types of, nothing came, again, from him. If he had been there, you would have expected to find some trace of DNA of him on her, whether that be some type of hair or some type of other DNA left on her. And also, just again, I know I've said this twice, but it was a really heinous crime. So I think that you would expect more DNA than less. And also, I think importantly, and maybe most importantly, his team says that this DNA match definitively says that he did not help in the rape, because the person that he said raped her clearly did not rape her, because there is no evidence of it. So his team is pointing not only to this as saying that he wasn't there and he did not have any involvement in the crime, but they're also saying that, hey, this just clearly shows that confession was a complete lie.
Yeah, because he implicated people who may not have been guilty as well as himself. Yeah, it kind of blows the story out of the water a little bit. Well, if I'm on a jury, or if I'm an investigator and I'm coming to this fresh, I mean, you've got DNA evidence of a guy who clearly fits the profile of a murderer, because he is. I kind of start there and then see if I can pull Barber, back into it if that's where I'm led. But it seems that they want to sit on the conviction that they have. I understand why. I mean, that's the state's job, is to convict people. But who with the state would call for a new trial? I mean, does that sit with the AG's office?
So the AG's office is currently defending this case in the conviction. The case right now is in the federal court system. And so assistant attorney generals under Steve Marshall are actually defending the case now. So you just kind of talked about, what theory could they have that they're trying to defend the case? Yeah. The argument that they're trying to make is, and they make it very clear to say in court filings, hey, we don't have to offer an argument or a defense. That's not our job. That's not our burden to meet. But they still do add in a couple of theories. And they said their exact words were the most likely theories. One, they say, is that Jerry Tyrone Jackson, whose DNA was identified as being in and on Mrs. Roberts, prosecutors say, well, she could have had consensual sex with Jackson. And then in a couple of hours later, this group of homeless men come in her house, and then everything happens according to Barber's confession. And they would just say that in that case that Hester, the co-defendant, just didn't leave behind any DNA. So that's one of their theories. Their other theory that they have proposed, it was about one line in a court filing, so they didn't provide a lot of detail, but they said that maybe this means that Barber and Jackson worked together instead of Barber and Hester. And his team, then Barber's team, comes back and says there is no evidence that the two men, Jackson and Barber, ever knew each other. Barber was homeless and living behind the mall in Montgomery, which was on kind of the opposite side of town of this neighborhood. They were not the same age. They didn't run in the same circles. So his team has said that they never found any connection between the two.
That would be a heck of a coincidence for her to have one brutal murderer in her home and then later that day be visited by others.
Yeah, they the judge in the case, Judge Marks, and again, this is a federal case, this is a federal judge, she said that the state's theory was pretty unbelievable. And I put some actual quotes from the judge's order in that story, and I would encourage people to read those because that's pretty strong language coming from a federal judge.
Okay. So, and I think you touched on this or said it, but I'm a little slow on the draw sometimes, so I'm going to ask again. With if the state doesn't decide to, hey, we think we may have the wrong person, we're gonna figure out the truth and do this again. Is there any indication that the higher court might actually force something, or is this just the kind of things that we always go through in death penalty cases? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it absolutely makes sense. And as you know, Ike, and probably some of your audience knows by now, I also cover death row and executions and have for a long time here in Alabama. And I will say that over the time I've done that, and even look, I've been here for 10 years, and there has never been a case of what is called in the legal world, in the federal legal world, it's called, quote, actual innocence, quote. That's the term used for these types of cases. It's a habeas corpus case, but there's different types of habeas corpus cases. And the one this is called a, quote, actual innocence, quote, case. This is the first one of those that I've covered that's gotten this far here in Alabama. And this is actually the first one in modern Alabama history that has ever passed through this really technical procedural gateway in federal court to go forward under actual innocence. It's a very, very narrow hole, essentially, and a narrow place for a case to be able to pass through. A gateway is what they call it. And this is the first one in Alabama. So at least in modern history. So that's a big deal already. This case has already gone further than death row cases really ever go in Alabama. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So does that kind of mean they're trying to prove innocence in this case?
Yeah, that's exactly what that means. This is habeas corpus cases. Typically you see in death row cases, which are saying, there's this reason of why this went wrong at trial. There's this reason of ineffective assistance of counsel. Those are all kinds of reasons. And there are innocence cases that come up as well. But again, this type of case is called actual innocence. And it means that there is proof of somebody's innocence, essentially. That is boiling it down from the legal jargon. But again, that's a big deal in the death row world, because a lot of times you see in these death row cases, people that say, maybe they should have not gotten capital murder, or maybe they should have gotten a lesser charge, a lesser degree of murder, or maybe they shouldn't have been eligible for the death penalty. They don't necessarily fight the conviction. And now we do have several on Alabama, several high-profile cases. You think to Forrest Johnson, Rocky Myers. There are quite a few who have always claimed innocence. But again, this case is different in the sense of the specific legal definition that they're going after. And again, the fact that they've gotten this far in the federal court system. So the judge ruled last fall that Barber's case met that actual innocence standard. And again, essentially what that means is that it could go forward. It had passed some other like time bars and some other procedural issues. But if a judge says that it is an actual innocence case and it meets all of these very narrow criteria, then it can go forward. So the judge ruled in favor of Barber last fall for that, which again was a big win for Barber's team. And now the judge has to rule on the merits of the case. So the judge could still come back and say, no, I don't believe that this proves his actual innocence. But essentially making it through that gateway was the first step, because they had to say like, hey, even look at the merits of our case to begin with. Just look at the case as a whole. So they've met that. Now the judge can actually rule on the merits of the case. But again, our court systems move slowly. Anybody who has ever followed a real court case knows that is not the CSI effect of an hour. And that ruling from the judge came last fall. We are in the midsummer of 2025. There's been nothing legally that has changed in the case since then. The judge did ask for the two sides, the state and Barber's team, to try to work it out on their own and send them to mediation. And the last filing was in late May from that case about the mediation, and both sides had said they couldn't come to an agreement at mediation. So now we just wait to see if they go back to mediation or they try to work it out between themselves. And if not, then we will have to wait on Judge Marks to decide what she's going to do.
Okay. Thank you, because I really need my hand held when I'm working through a court case like this.
No, you have to. Some of this gets so complicated, and lawyers around, and again, I'm not trying to offend them. I have one at home. I am married to one, but they sometimes can make things so complicated. Instead of just, like journalists, we try to just get it out in as few words as possible. And lawyers do not feel that way. They try the opposite way. They try to use as many words as possible to say one thing.
Oh, yeah, that is a great point. Maybe that's why, we bump heads with lawyers so often.
It must be. Again, personal experience, I can tell you.
Yeah, I know. And you've taken it all the way there.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah. Is this story part of a new series? I'm asked that in a question, and I know the answer, but that's,
We always love a leading question. Yes, this is the first installment of my Alabama versus Science series. And in this series, I'm highlighting several cases in Alabama where the state is at odds and the state's prosecutors are at odds with modern day science. And in this case, specifically, that's particular science that I was talking about was the DNA. Mm-hmm. And I want to add one more thing in here, Ike, and you might cut me off, give me one of those old school movie clippers.
I would never.
That, I am that I'm over my limit. But one thing, I really didn't mention this in the story, so this is a good tidbit. This is an extra for your listeners. One thing that Barber's lawyers also argued, and I didn't put it very much in detail in the story because it's kind of supplemental and it can get kind of inside baseball, but I think it's important. They said that, yes, in the early 90s, DNA was clearly not what it is now. There was a rudimentary type DNA testing that was done, and that was introduced at trial. Now, Barber's team says that a trained professional at the time in 1993 would have been able to say this DNA, this evidence did not belong to Barber or to Hester. Barber's team says it could have been conclusively excluded at the time. And would that have and if that would have happened, then maybe Barber wouldn't be sitting on death row today. Now, I put that part in the story, but what I didn't add in the story is kind of the back and forth of that. So this was actually, again, introduced at trial, this evidence. And the way that this DNA testing worked, if you think of almost like a bingo card, and you know how you have those markers that mark the dots on a bingo card, that's kind of what this DNA test looked like. And there was a sample, and then different types of solution were via dropper were added to the sample, and there were dots, and the dots correlated to different alleles in the blood type. And so you would have several different alleles, and you could not specifically say who something belonged to, but you could say that the person who contributed this DNA has the alleles of 1 and 4, right? So you could match alleles. Granted, that is also a much bigger pool than what we have from DNA now. You get DNA now and it says, 1 in 1 billion persons left this here. This DNA was a lot more broad, but you could still match alleles. So if my blood type didn't match the alleles, then again, that would have left me conclusively excluded from the sample. And the reason, again, that I say all this and I get in the weeds is because that test at the time of trial, and I've seen photos of it introduced in court records, it said, and it had the alleles, that it did not belong to Christopher Hester. That was known at the time of Barber's trial. Now, the reason that never got brought up, and you could, I guess technically you don't know the reason, we could speculate, but it never was brought up at trial. The only thing that was brought up was that, hey, we have this DNA testing. And it was pretty much left at that. You can look at court transcripts to see the prosecutor never asked the person who described this testing I just described to you and might have botched describing. They had an expert describe the testing, but the prosecutors didn't ask who it belonged to. And the defense didn't ask who it belonged to. And again, you could take a lot of meanings from that. I think that one thing a lot of people take away from that is that at the time, we as a society did not understand blood typing and DNA and the type of science that we do now. And I also think if you are if you are Chris Barber's team, you don't want to ask a question that could get you somewhere that you don't want to be, right? And the prosecutors didn't bring it up. And you could say that that's a strategic decision. So they just left the jury with knowing that there was blood evidence taken. And you can assume that maybe the jury thought, well, of course it matches, or they wouldn't have brought it up.
Right.
But again, that could have been an assumption that was made, but that was never brought out. That was never testified to. But again, I have seen court records and notes even from judges' chambers from that time, and it was conclusively not matched to Hester. So Barber's attorneys say now, not only could it have been, but you could have excluded Barber and Hester. If you would have even just mentioned that it excluded Hester, that would have called into question the entire confession back in 93.
Yeah, because by then he was already saying that he was coerced, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
Okay. Yeah, obviously, that would not have helped the state's case at the time, and it surely makes it look questionable now.
It was just very odd. And again, though, I think that it's probably really easy for a lot of people to judge what lawyers did at the time. But we have to remember, and if you are a lawyer that practiced in the early 90s, then yes, you have every right to question that and wonder why that happened. But I think for a lot of us, we have to think like, man, like, look, I was not, I was born in the early 90s. So I was not, obviously, I'm not qualified to say what I would or wouldn't have asked in the early 90s, because again, you just don't know what you don't know. And at the time, they did not know how specific we were going to be able to get with DNA. And people might not have even known how specific you would get with it at the time. I mean, I didn't know till I started researching this case that you could even figure out alleles at the time and match those alleles.
Now, I'm not a lawyer, but this anecdote you just gave me about this case sounds like something that a judge could really take a look at when considering whether or not to overturn it.
Yeah, this is, again, another thing with kind of the actual innocence case we talked about for Barber is not necessarily like this one thing went wrong or this one piece of evidence is an issue. And that's what a lot of cases that I see are. A lot of appeals focus on one kind of specific thing.
Right.
But this is more just looking at the whole of the case and saying, nope, it's an innocence case. This is not constitutional. So she could take that into account. I think that with this case, there's so many twists and turns. I think there's probably a lot to take into account.
Well, the series, again, is Science versus Alabama, I believe.
No, the series, again, is Alabama versus Science.
Ah! All right.
You're getting backwards here, Ike.
Alabama versus Science. And Ivana Rinku is the reporter working on the series. She's the reporter who brought us Denied, the series about the the broken parole system here in Alabama. Ivana, thanks so much for coming on down in Alabama and talking about this.
Thank you so much, Ike. You actually pulled me away. We were both in the newsroom today, which is a rarity, and you pulled me away from working on another denied story, another parole board story. So I've got to get back to my desk and finish that one. But maybe that'll be out by the time that you post this, and your listeners can read what you pulled me away to talk about.
I will link in show notes to all of the above and maybe more. Who knows?
That's good.
Crazy with links. Yeah. Thanks for coming on. It's always a pleasure. And thank you, everybody out there, for listening to us. We're going to be back here bright and early Monday morning. Until then, as always, come by and see what we're doing anytime you want to on the World Wide Web at AL.com.